Okay, thanks. Basically what I wanted to talk is about the problem of victimhood and lack of acknowledged of victimhood of certain national and ethnic groups as a source or reason for anti-Semitism. And now, first some issues that I think inspired you to invite me and inspired me to talk about this kind of research. So one thing that struck me very much during this recent wave of very harsh criticism of Israel that included some anti-Semitic remarks as well, was the involvement of many minority group members in these movements. So if you look at these big rallies that were proposing, many of them, to erase Israel from the map and to create free Palestine from the river to the sea, many of the participants of those rallies were neither very strongly politically committed, and neither they were coming from Middle East, and many of them were active in this movement and are active in this movement because of a sort of solidarity of victimized nations or victimized groups. So you see many Black people here, for example, many Latin Americans. And the problem of anti-Semitism among those minority groups is something really pronounced. So, you know, including statements from Kanye West that you probably all remember, or years ago by a French comic Dieudonné. But also you can trace it back to Louis Farrakhan, right? And to Nation of Islam, that also made anti-Semitism part of its large political agenda. And so this is something really surprising. I mean, all of us who are, you know, raised on Mississippi burning and on all those narratives about the involvement of Jews in civil rights movement and in supporting minority causes all around the world. I mean, from Joe Slovo in South Africa to American students, you know, going to the southern states of the US and fighting for the rights of Black Americans. This is quite surprising to see such a strong anti-Jewish hatred today among particularly minorities. And one thing that I would like to propose here, that maybe this comes from the problem of victimhood and the role of victimhood in the identity of those ethnic groups and national groups. So what do we know in psychology about this problem? First of all, there are many national identities that are built on victimhood, on the idea of victimhood. And there are great works by, for example, Daniel Bartal in Israel about the role of victimhood and of trauma and victimhood in building of Israeli identity. But you have this kind of work also in other countries. So in Poland, Ireneusz Krzemiński wrote about the role of victimhood in Polish national identity. So many countries and also many ethnic groups and many minorities are very much the notion of being a victim is very central to their identities. Now, we also know from psychological research that there is a big problem when the two groups who have these kind of identities are in conflict, because then these national identities based on victimhood are used as justification for certain hostile activities in the conflict. So basically, what is known as competitive victimhood, so competition about who is more victimized, who is a greater victim, is known to deteriorate intergroup relations in many, many conflict areas. And works by Massinur, for example, show that in many very violent conflicts are actually based on this competition of who is more victimized. And of course, the current conflict in the Middle East is a good example of that. Also, we know from studies conducted in Germany that just stressing the fact that Jews are still suffering because of the harms that were committed by Germans in the past, by Germans during the Holocaust, this might elicit anti-Semitism among Germans. So the sense of responsibility, the fact that the victims are still suffering, puts a lot of blame, a lot of burden on the historical perpetrators. And in fact, it doesn't lead to reconciliation, surprisingly, but on the very implicit level, it actually breeds anti-Semitism among the perpetrators. Also, we know from psychology, and this is like the kind of theoretical foundation to what I will be talking about today, that superordinate categories, those large categories, like, for example, we are all victims, do not always improve intergroup relations, because lay people would say, okay, if they are all victims, then this should create some form of common identity, right? We are victimized groups, and this should lead to reconciliation, to positive relations between groups, but in fact, it does not. But this is not the only case that such common categories are not really not really improving intergroup relations. Just to name, I don't know, the category of being from the Middle East, right? And you see how hostile today are Jews coming from Mizrahi countries. You know, they're particularly anti-Arab today, right? Because of feeling that, you know, they share too much of similarities, you know, right? So that's actually somehow threatening if you share this common identity with other people who are not the same group as you are. Now, okay, I'll go closer to my own context, to Poland. And in Poland, of course, this has been an issue for a long time. So on the left side of the screen, you can see a monument that has been erected on the Muranów Square in the very, very important and central part of the Warsaw Ghetto, where the biggest fights were happening during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. So this is where the Jewish military organization, so the second biggest insurgent organization during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, was fighting against Germans. The area of very, very heavy fights in that period. What you see there, you see a huge monument commemorating the Polish victims of resettlements to Siberia, right? So this wagon commemorates the Poles who were resettled to Siberia. Were they resettled from Muranów Square? Of course not. This was completely Jewish area of Warsaw. This was not place completely irrelevant to this historical story. Why is it there? Because, of course, a place which has such an important significance for the Jewish history of victimhood is threatening to the status of Poles as victims. The second screen is a caricature by a Polish right-wing journalist, Cezary Krzysztopa, that was created in 2018, when we had this debate over the Holocaust law in Poland. Just this Holocaust law already is part of the same kind of story. And I think you might have heard about this law to ban any blames of Polish complicity during the Holocaust. But it's interesting about this reaction. So in reaction to that, he painted this cartoon, Polish Holocaust, portraying these two people. So the German Nazi and the Soviet communist who are killing a Polish patriot. But apparently the Soviet star here is a Star of David, is Magen David, right? So it's suggesting that, okay, Jews are not only, they are not victims, but the fact that to show the Polish victimhood, you actually need to make those, to associate Jews with the perpetrators here. So this is something we've been studying for quite long, and I want to show you part of results from a study when we actually very directly looked at that. So we measured the sense of victimhood. So how important is victimhood to national identity of Polish people on two large studies, one representative sample, one online sample. And we basically asked participants, do you think that Polish nation has been more often victimized than any other nation in the world? Do people believe that? And actually quite a lot of people in Poland believe that. And you can see it is a strong predictor of all forms of antisemitism that we measured. So we measured traditional antisemitism. So basically blood libel accusation, beliefs blaming Jews for killing Jesus. So if people think that Poles were more victimized than others in the past, it's more probable that they will also share those traditional anti-Semitic beliefs. Also the secondary anti-Semitic beliefs, so those, denial of responsibility for crimes against Jews, etc. Believe in Jewish conspiracy. The same people who believe that Poles were the unique victims of history would more often believe in Jewish conspiracy. But also very practically, they would be more willing to discriminate Jews, so they would be less accepting, for example, Jews as their neighbors or as co-workers in their companies. So those all measures of social distance are also positively related to the sense of victimhood. So this is basically correlational findings, but it seems that it's very replicable across different phenomena. So we thought that this might be really viewed in that way, that, okay, when you think about the Second World War, obviously, Polish people have very strong memory of the harms committed by Germans in Poland. There is a lot of tragedies. Polish people were sent to concentration camps. They were killed. They were massacred. But of course, not as a whole nation. I mean, you needed to do something, right? So if you were politically engaged, if you were in the underground, of course, you will be a part of those repressions. There were also some repressions that were just for, including all people, like the massacre of Wola district in Warsaw. But this never targeted the whole nation, right? This was never a planned mass annihilation of the whole ethnic or religious group, as in the case of the Holocaust. So Polish people think about this past, but whenever the Jewish history is mentioned, whenever the history of the Holocaust is mentioned, it can create this when people think about victimhood, then suddenly these other victims are somehow threatening, right? They are not part of the same prototype of being the victim, the war victim, which the prototype here is, of course, being the Polish victim. So to measure that and to address this problem, we wanted to distinguish these two different phenomena. So one is the victimhood competition, or the relative importance of viewing your nation as more victimized than Jewish people. So this is what we call relative in-group victimhood. So my group was more often victimized than Jews. And we wanted to distinguish that from the more general sense of victimhood, that we were victims. We were more victimized than any other nation in the world, right? So we thought that when we put these two into regression model, we can look whether it's basically a consequence of competing over victimhood with Jews, or whether it's a consequence of a general sense of being a victimized nation. So I'll skip that, but we measured here both negative attitudes toward Jews and anti-Semitism. And we found that even if we control for this, let's say, competitiveness in victimhood with Jews, still the sense that we are victimized, we were the real victims of the history, this is still predictive of anti-Semitism. This still breeds anti-Semitic prejudice and negative views about Jews. So there is something important in the sense of victimhood, which cannot be just reduced to a competition with Jews over victimhood. So now let's move to another context. And these are images from one monument in Thessaloniki, in Salonika, in Greece, that has been very frequently damaged by Greeks. And of course, Greece is an interesting context because in Greece, you also have this very, very strong sense of being victimized in the history. So there were a lot of massacres committed by Germans during the war in Greece, but also it's somehow very politically important issue today. So Greeks, for example, blame Germans today for the economic crisis, right? So it's still used in politics. They say, okay, this is the way we were treated in the past, but this is the same way we are treated today. And for example, Greeks have raised a lot of claims, material claims against Germany, because they think that Germany today is also somehow complicit in, creating economic difficulties in Greece as part of European Union. So we can see from the work by Antonio Dinas and Kosmidis, very similar pattern as we have witnessed in Poland. So this correlation pattern shows how people's responses to questions measuring anti-Semitism are related first to the idea that Greeks have suffered more than anybody else in history. So this is what we call absolute sense of victimhood. And Greeks suffered more than Jews. So this is this relative victimhood compared to Jews. And you can see that there is a positive correlation. Here maybe it's a little bit curvilinear, but basically you can see this positive correlational pattern. So the more people believe that Greeks suffered more than Jews, the more they would agree with the statement that Jews are exploiting the Holocaust for their own material purposes. And they would be more willing to deny Jews the right to buy land in Greece. So this is obviously an discriminatory support for discriminatory politics. And the same you can see also for the statement Greeks have suffered more than others. So basically, the more a Greek person thinks that he's a member of a very victimized nation, the more hostile against Jews the person would be. And another example, I've seen the face of Anna here, so I'm very happy to see Anna in the audience, because actually I'm now going to talk about studies that were one study from a line of wonderful research by Anna and Gilad Hirschberger, who actually made an experiment with that. So they basically presented Hungarian history during the war using different framing. So they either stressed the story of victimhood. If I'm not correct here, then please, Anna, correct me, stressing that Hungarians were real victims. Why I showed you actually this image? Because this image is an image of a monument erected in Budapest to commemorate the Hungarian victimhood during the Second World War, which is a little bit of a paradox if you know Hungarian history, right? I mean, Hungarians under Horthy were on the same side with the Nazis, right? And then under Arrow-Cross movement, under Szálasi, they were even more complicit, right? So you cannot really talk a lot about Hungarian suffering. In a sense, you can talk about, I don't know, Belarusian suffering or even Polish suffering. Hungary was on a different side in this conflict, right? Of course, there were victims of different kinds and political victims and so on, but it was not a massive victimhood of a nation, which is really portrayed by this monument. And there was a lot of opposition from Holocaust scholars, from Holocaust commemorators in Hungary, who said, this is denialist. I mean, this takes basically recognition away from the Jewish victimhood of Hungarian Jews. So this is something that Anna and Gilad have studied, and what they have shown, so if you stress the victimhood in Hungary, as compared to this gray bar, the gray bar is acknowledgement of responsibility. So basically talking about the involvement of Hungarians in the Holocaust. So about, for example, the massacres committed by the Arrow-Cross movement in the last months of the Second World War. So if you talk about this accurate perception of the history of the Holocaust, you can see that that anti-Semitism is actually lower. So if you present history in that way, you actually reduce anti-Semitism compared to this blue bar, so the group that has heard about Hungarians as victims of the war. And this was the condition where people didn't get any information about the crimes that Hungarians committed against Jews. So I was surprised by this study, because I would expect that there would be a defensive reaction. That if you tell Hungarians, okay, you were massively killing Jews, what I would expect then psychologically, that they would say, no, maybe Jews maybe Jews are responsible themselves for what happened. Or like in the case of secondary anti-Semitism, we should stop talking about the past. We should focus about the future, on the future. They would maybe think about Jewish conspiracies. The Jewish historians conspire and then they blame us for this. This didn't happen. On the contrary, the increases in anti-Semitism you would see rather when you present the narrative of Hungarian wartime history using the framework of victimhood. Hungarians were victims. Why? Because then Jews are enemies, because Jews are the more victimized group, so people don't want to hear about them. And this might reinforce anti-Semitism. Another and even more surprising context, I would say, is the context of Congolese immigrants in Belgium. And these are studies that have been done by Laura Licata and Laura de Guismet. It was her doctoral project at the Free University of Brussels with Laurent Licata. And what they were surprised and a little puzzled. So they started from this Dieudonné. I mean, why Dieudonné the hell is, why he's anti-Semitic? I mean, he comes from a part of the world when there were almost no Jews, right? And the same they found among Congolese immigrants in Belgium. So there was a certain level of anti-Semitism among Congolese immigrants in Belgium. And again, like, why Congolese immigrants? I mean, maybe there are some diamond mines in Congo that are owned by Oppenheim family, but most people would not have any connection to anything Jewish, right? I mean, there were no Jews in Congo. So they said that maybe this is exactly because of the competition in victimhood, but particularly in case when this victimhood is not properly recognized. And you see this man said, King Leopold II killed 15 million of Congolese people. We want justice for Congo. And this is, in fact, a very important tension in Belgium today. So Belgian king, Congo was Belgian colony. It was not even a Belgian colony. It was owned basically by a Belgian king who was exploiting local population. And it led to annihilation of masses of Congolese people. So this is a trauma that happened, more than a century ago, but it's still part of the collective memory in Congo. And the particular problem here is that Belgium never took real responsibility for that. So until the study has been done, there was no really big reparations or big compensation for what happened during the massacres in Congo. That's something which Congolese people feel because they see, for example, in Mechelen, in Malines, yes, the Dosarne-Kasirn, you can see a lot of commemorative places related to the history of the Holocaust, of Jewish people who were sent from Belgium to Nazi death camps and to the ghettos and death camps in Eastern Europe. But there is no commemoration of the crime that was not committed by Germans, but by the local king, right? And this is something they wanted to test. And this is what the pattern that they found in several studies, that the higher level of collective victimhood among Congolese immigrants, when it's linked to lack of recognition, a sense of we are not, so when you know about this history, you realize it's not really properly recognized by your country. And this leads to this competition over who gets recognized. You view Jews as the ones whose victimhood is properly recognized and yours is not. And it breeds anti-Semitism, basically. And this is a pattern which they observed in Belgium, but then we replicated this in many other contexts. So there was one study in Hungary that showed that very similar process works among Hungarians who say, okay, we have this trauma of Trianon Treaty that deprived us of our territories, and so many hundreds of thousands of Hungarians became, emigrants, particularly because these parts of Hungary were lost to Romania and to other countries. So this is a trauma which is not properly recognized. Now the Holocaust is recognized. So if we see that one trauma is recognized, another trauma is not recognized, this makes us more anti-Semitic. We've seen the same process in Poland. We replicated the same pattern of findings in Poland. And there was also a study in Serbia that found very, very similar thing, that in Serbia also this sense of lack of proper recognition of victimhood was leading to anti-Semitism. It also leads to the biased perceptions of the Holocaust. And this is a study that we've been doing in collaboration with colleagues from several parts as part of a larger project done by one of NGOs. In different countries in Eastern Europe, we looked at how people view behavior during the Holocaust, because we wanted to analyze whether these perceptions of the Holocaust are biased. And we found that, in fact, they are biased in those different countries. So basically, we asked people in all those countries, how do they view behavior of their compatriots during the Holocaust? How the average Hungarian today views the percentage of different behaviors during the Holocaust. How average Polish person views the frequency of different behaviors during the Holocaust. So you can see here, the pattern is almost the same in all those studies countries. And in Poland, the average Polish person would say 60% of Polish people during the Holocaust were feeling compassion toward Jewish people. More than 50% of Polish people were rescuing Jews during the Holocaust. This is what the average Polish person would say today. I mean, it's enormous bias, right? It's impossible. I mean, if half of the Polish population would be active in rescuing Jews, then probably we would have still millions of Jewish people in Poland and not 5,000, right? And the same is we see in Slovakia, for example. In Slovakia, the average Slovakian would say 40% of Slovakians were rescuing Jews. In Hungary, average Hungarian would say 45% of Hungarians were rescuing Jews. So you can see that there is a lot of overestimation of heroic acts that in fact were very rare. So we try to make this measure of a bias. So people who would say that the passive behaviors like, indifference, feeling schadenfreude, acts of collaboration were very, very rare, and overestimation of helping behavior. So when you create this index of biased perception of the Holocaust, you can see that it's mostly related to the victimhood, right? So again, you see now the betas. So the really important predictor of these biased perceptions of the Holocaust is the sense to which a person, this what we call exclusive victimhood. So we are more victimized than any other nation in the world. We are the unique victims. We are the only victims of the history. And now the last thing that I wanted to show you from research that we've been doing on that, something that we've never published actually, is the study that was based on this decision-making. This is something which is called Vladimir's choice. It was a study which was done years ago in the context of the relation between students, majority and minority students in the US. So basically, students were informed that there will be a new organization developed, a new fund developed at our university, and it will allow funding existing organizations. The one working for white students and another working for minority students. Now, how would you like to distribute resources? So the university proposes several ways to distribute funds between these two organizations. Okay, so now you see the potential distribution. First distribution is, let's say, $19,000 goes to the organization of white student, 25,000 goes to the minority organization. Okay, so the first option is a lot of funding goes to the majority, but even more goes to the minority. And then you see there are different other distributions. Here you see half by half. Okay, so quite a lot goes to the majority, and also quite a lot goes to the minority. And now you have the last option, where the majority gets really small money, right? $7,000. That's really not a lot. I mean, compared to 19,000, it's not really beneficial to your in-group. But the minority gets much less. The minority gets almost nothing, right? So this last option is not really beneficial to the majority. It's not beneficial to the participants of the study, but the only benefit it gets, it increases the difference, right? It increases the relative difference between us and them. They get less than we do. So we thought, okay, let's do something similar. Okay, let's do something similar with two museums. We have two big museums in Warsaw. The Museum of the History of Polish Jews that commemorates the victims of the Holocaust. It's in Muganów. It's close. It's located in the former Jewish ghetto, and is the large museum. And there's another museum very similar to that, the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising. So museum commemorating the Polish victimhood and Polish suffering. So we said, okay, look, imagine that the municipality of Warsaw wants to distribute some funding between those two museums. And what do you think would be the best distribution of this funding? So you can see the options. They're identical as in this previous study by Sidanius. So first option gives a lot of money to this Polish museum, but it gives even more money to the Jewish museum. The last option gives some money to the Polish museum, but not a lot, but it just guarantees that the Jewish museum doesn't get almost anything, right? That the donation for the Jewish museum is very, very low. Now, what we've seen in this study, and that the most frequently chosen option was the option 7. So the option that was giving very, very small funding to the Polish museum, but just to be sure that the Jewish museum doesn't get anything. And we wanted to see who are those people who want this kind of distribution. And we found, what are the sources of that? Either it can be, a consequence of antisemitism. Basically, these are anti-Semites. They don't want to give any funding to Jewish museum. Maybe it's just a very high collective victimhood. They want to commemorate the victimhood of their own nation, and they would view this commemoration of the other group as somehow threatening to that. maybe they're just not interested in history, so they overall don't want to give money to museums, right? Because if your strategy is, I'm not interested in history, I don't want to waste municipal money for museums, you would also choose this last option, right? Because overall, it gives the lowest total amount of money to this museum. So this is what we wanted to test, and in the regression model that we've conducted here on this data, we found that actually all of these are positively correlated, of course, with it. But if you put them into one regression model, anti-Semitism and interest in history are not really strong predictors. The strongest predictor is national identification, how strongly you identify with your nation, and the sense of national victimhood. The more you feel that we were the unique victims of history, the more you would choose, there is a higher probability that you would choose this option that does not give really a lot of money to commemoration of your own nation, but deprives Jews even more, right? So that gives you just the benefit over Jews in this commemoration rather than an overall money to your own nation. So this is an interesting paradox. And we now we thought that maybe we actually should somehow work with it. Maybe it all comes from lack of recognition, as we found in those studies that we've conducted with Laura and that Laura conducted in Belgium. So, okay, if the problem here is recognition, and this is what if you analyze public discourse in Poland, you see a lot of that, complaining that, we never get proper recognition. So we thought, how to create this situation of recognition? We thought, let's make a fake article about the new, so this was the time when Barack Obama was the president of the US. And he said, okay, Americans created a new museum to commemorate the Second World War. Okay, a museum dedicated to global history. But during the opening of this museum, Barack Obama has openly commemorated the victims, and he was particularly mentioning the Jewish victims, right? So in this small article, there was a very strong, you could see that he mentioned the Holocaust as part of that. And he didn't mention any other victims. Then in the second condition, he explicitly mentioned the suffering of Jewish victims and of Polish victims. So suddenly, it's quite surprising to Polish people, but okay, I mean, this would be, very much welcomed that Barack Obama mentioned the Polish victimhood during the war. In the third condition, he particularly mentioned the Polish victims of the war, and he didn't mention much of other victims explicitly. In the fourth condition, he didn't mention any of national groups. So we had these four conditions, and we could test, and we also measured this commemorative bias in the end. What we found here in this study, we wanted to see what can reduce the commemorative bias. So when he mentioned only Polish victims, you can see that this was slightly lower than in the condition that he mentioned only Jewish victims, that he mentioned both groups, and the highest level of bias was when he did not mention Jews, he didn't mention Poles. So if you look at this pattern of results, you can see that actually, first of all, of course, if Poles are only mentioned as the victims, you can feed this narcissistic need of recognition. But even if both groups are mentioned, you also see really significant improvement as compared to the situation when none of these groups is really mentioned. So I think this is quite an important finding when you think about commemoration, when you think about the problem of victimhood, that you can actually feed somehow this need for recognition by a proper recognition. And I think this is the main point and the main message I want to stress here. The more other nations and other ethnic groups are properly recognized, the less we would have anti-Semitism, which stems from victimhood. And I think this is a global problem today, to give people a very, very strong impression that, for example, Holocaust, because of the Holocaust, the international law defined the term genocide, right? The term genocide would never appear in international law if not the Holocaust and if not Raphael Lemkin would put it into this international legal system. So this allowed to properly address the tragedy in Rwanda, the tragedy in Cambodia, and in many other places in the world. So basically, it seems that the sense of unacknowledged victimhood is a crucial problem in anti-Semitism today in many societies, which not only is responsible for anti-Semitism, but also for biases in decisions, support for discriminatory policies against Jews, etc. And it seems that acknowledgement of past victimhood might potentially help improve attitudes toward Jews and reduce biases. So it's in our good interest that all other tragedies in the world will be properly recognized. So this is why I'm very, very upset that Israel has never recognized Armenian genocide, for example. I don't see a good reason for that, because really the more we acknowledge these crimes, the more we can sell this message that the Holocaust was basically a kind of model crime that allowed proper global recognition of other crimes, and this might reduce anti-Semitic responses, and maybe even in such situations as what happens today regarding Israel and Gaza. And I'm looking forward to your comments on that and your thoughts. Thank you.